Good day, ladies and gentlemen. This is Some Christian Guy, and I'm back today with another video. And today is actually based on a viewer question. And this question comes courtesy of a friend of mine whose name is Francis Law. Shout out to my brother Francis. If you're watching this, thank you very much for your question. And I'm addressing it here because I thought it was an absolutely brilliant question, and it's one I get a lot. And you actually find this question a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to go through it. Right. So his question is, right. Where should I actually start? He says over here. So this is the conversation, basically how it starts, right? So he says to me, what do you think of causality? Now, for those of you who don't know, causality is very simple. It's like the concept of cause and effect, right? If X, then Y. So if I run into traffic, I'm going to get hit by a car, kind of thing, right? If this, then that. That's the law of causality. That everything that exists has a cause that brought it into existence, right? Nothing wrong with it. It makes perfect sense. If this, then that. Very good, right? So he says he's struggling with the concept of it a little bit. And he confirms it by saying you do X and Y is the effect. That's causality. So I said I see nothing wrong. So here's where he presents his dilemma. Right now, here's the thing. He's actually a Christian. He believes in God and stuff like that, much like I do. And this is a question that actually rises up within religion, but also not only just within religion, but in the secular world as well. It's a bit of an issue. So not that in the secular world that they don't believe in causality, but they don't believe that we necessarily have free will. And this is what it's getting to, right? He says, I watched a favorite show of mine called Berserk. I've never seen it before, so I have no idea what he's talking about, right? Causality is represented not as X or Y, but as a denial to be subject to the whims of fate, right? To carve one's own path. Causality, is therefore used as a replacement for purpose, right? And it is an interesting concept, and it's certainly something that means something to me in a way that I can't express. If I look back over the year, a lot has changed, but I made the choices that led to those decisions. My most recent car accident, could I have rear-ended the person that dangerously swerved in front of me? Yes, I could have, but in order to mitigate the damage, I swerved left and chose to inflict more damage on myself instead and spare the person in front of me. It says it's easy to blame circumstance or fate, but the choice lies not in predestination nor the whims of fate. There are circumstances I cannot control that have happened, but the choices, a little bit of a spelling error, it's Facebook, so it's Facebook Messenger. The choices that led me here were mine and mine alone. There's no, but she did this or he did this, which left me with no choice. The damage and the choices are mine, and the onus of responsibility lies on me. I don't know how to phrase it other than I'm a volatile person, yes, but I seek peace and I choose to pursue my message, my dream, and some of them carry a heavy price. So basically what he's talking about over here is and this is an argument that has been discussed for forever, right? And today specifically, it's become quite important, specifically with the rise of what we call modernity and the postmodern world and all these kinds of things, where there's a strict adherence to naturalism. So here's basically what it is. It's like, do we really have free will, right? Now, it's absolutely essential in Christian thought that you have free will. And the reason for this is because if there was no such thing as free will, then you couldn't be judged by God, right? Because then, you can only be judged for what you choose to do. And in the Christian worldview, we have free will and therefore are responsible for the decisions that we make. So he's quite correct that when we talk about I had no choice, there's no such thing as there was no choice. There is always a choice, and you are held responsible for those choices, or at least to a part. So for example, if someone takes your family hostage and says, I'm going to kill your family if you don't go into that shop over there and steal $1,000, then there's coercion and things like that that's involved. But at the end of the day, you still had a choice where you could say, well, I'm not going to do it, even if it meant. So there is a choice. It's just sometimes the consequences of those choices might be unbearable or undesirable, so we feel like our choice has been taken away from us. but not necessarily the case. You could still say, well, go ahead and kill my family. You could still say that, because that still represents a choice, but but because that choice is completely unthinkable, you felt like you're left with no option other than to comply. But the thing is, you yourself, because you love your family, restrict yourself to only one option. It's not because, objectively speaking, there is no choice. There is always that choice, even though it's quite an absolutely terrible choice indeed, which a lot of people face. So what he says over here, right? And now this is actually a very, very big subject in the world. Now, atheists generally, depending on which camp, it's not a homogenous thing by any means, but generally speaking, if you think about people like Sam Harris, for example, if I'm not mistaken, and I apologize if I'm misrepresenting him, is because there's nothing transcendent, there's no transcendental anything, right? And everything's just nature. And even your Richard Dawkins type people, is that we're just molecular machines and we just chug along. So the idea that we have free will is actually an illusion. We don't really have free will. It's just the system is so complex that we have to pretend and behave as if we do have free will. But free will is actually an illusion. It doesn't actually exist. It doesn't exist. So what do we make of this sort of thing? And the reason why they say that, and a reason why a lot of people want to affirm that there is no such thing as free will, is because when they look at the universe, they see everything's very, very deterministic. You look at all the atoms and all, the law of gravity and the law of thermodynamics and everything, if this, then that, and everything chugs along in a very law-like fashion. Very law-like fashion, things are predictable, and they're affirming. And what they affirm is that if we knew absolutely every single thing that there was to know, for example, if we were omniscient, then we would be able to predict exactly how every single thing would turn out. No matter what, we would be able to predict every decision that people make, every choice, and that would then unveil the fact that we actually have no free will, which is a very, very, very interesting, and actually is a powerful argument, because a lot of people actually buy into this. But now the Christians would say, no, this is not the case at all. We actually do have free will. We can actually make choices. So how do we deal with this? Now here's the thing. There is a mistake in the thought of the secular world, and even in the religious world you find it. There's a mistake that determinism means no ability. So what is this? Just because something chugs along in a deterministic manner does not mean that you can necessarily predict the outcome, even if you knew absolutely every single thing there is to know about everything there is to know. Why is this? Is because they have plugged in a completely purely naturalistic assumption right at the beginning. So they're saying that human beings are nothing but physical. We're only physical. Whereas the Bible affirms something very different. The Bible often says the wrestle within human beings is between the spirit and the flesh. So we have a spiritual substance, and we have, which is sort of outside of the materialistic world, right? And we have then the physical substance, which is our bodies and all of the chemical processes that happen inside us, which is why, and so we're subject to gravity, we're subject to thermodynamics, which is why we need to eat food for energy, and all these kinds of things. So the Christian worldview, essentially speaking, affirms that we have two natures, as it were. So how do we prove this? Because you could say, well, that's merely a philosophical convenience to get away from it. And here's the fact, right? Everything that is physical, right? And this is the classic liberal mindset, right? Is that there's nothing but the physical, natural world. There's no transcendence at all. There's nothing transcendence. But now, this is quite easily disproved. For example, take yourself as a human being. We know that every single cell in the human body regenerates or replenishes over time, right? It's one of those simple facts. Every 7 years, every single cell in your body changes, right? Yet you're still the same person. You have, and this is what we call, now we're actually arguing metaphysics here, by the way. There are certain things that, despite the changes that happen in the physical realm, these things remain consistent and the same and unchanging over time. Very, very strange. And this is something we experience as human beings. My body has changed. I'm no longer a 2-year-old. I'm no longer an infant, and I've grown up. I've gone through changes, but I'm still the same person. There's a permanence about me that cannot be explained by referring to my purely physical condition. And if you don't like that, there are other things as well. For example, things like numbers that exist in sort of what we call a platonic sense. So numbers, numbers are not a physical thing. There's nothing in the world that you look at to prove that numbers exist. Yet numbers exist, and they exist unchangingly. And some people will be like, oh, well, those people that affirm that numbers are merely a human convention, we just make it up, like the number 7 is number 7 only because we call it number 7, they're actually making a mistake there, because even if you called number 7 something else by another name, let's say you called the number 7 cheese, right? All you're doing, you're still referring to the same thing. You're just giving it a name. You're just using a different word to refer to the same thing, right? But the thing itself, the number 7, remains the same. And in some peculiar way, this immaterial, transcendent thing still somehow has an effect through into the physical world. And we see this when we apply mathematics to it. And it's very, very, very peculiar. It's getting into a very strange realm of things. So the fallacy lies in the fact that when people say that we don't have free will at all, what they have not understood is that what they're plugging into their assumption in order to reach that conclusion is the assumption that human beings are purely 100% completely nothing. We're nothing but physical processes chugging along, and we're no different to animals and things of that sort. And what is easily demonstrable and what is provable is that we're not. And you can prove that transcendent things exist. The human soul or the human spirit, whatever that might consist of, is not a physical thing, because we can tell it remains consistent over time. And even my friend who posed this question, where he refers to his accident, and we know that through his accident he had 2 really, really severe accidents over the past year and a bit, and the accidents were so severe that it actually caused some severe trauma to the brain. And when talking to him and things like that, and when doing personality traits with him, we see that his personality has actually changed. Because those of you who have watched my videos on personality traits, we know that personality can change over time. The personality can change, but he's still the same person. He's still the same person. He still has the same character. The personality has changed, so there's been increases in neuroticism and things like that, which you would expect with damage to the brain and things of that sort. But as an individual, he's still the same person. He's still the same individual. His personality has just shifted. And this is what the Bible is referring to when we talk about the human being wrestles with the spirit versus the flesh. The flesh is your personality, because if you refer back to personality trait theory, personality is your biological proclivity to do certain things, whereas you as an individual, the person, the spirit, that's your character. That is who you are, right? So you can be in a situation where you are inclined to do something, right? Your inner gut says. So for example, if you are a person that is low in agreeableness and high in volatility, and you meet a particular situation, your inner urge will be I need to start a fight or shout or do whatever. But your character, that voice inside your head, says, no, don't do that. That second voice, that's you, right? The first reaction, that knee-jerk reaction, that's your personality. The voice that says to you, whoa, hold on, this is not the right thing to do, that's actually you, right? Where is that you? And people have tried to talk about it. They talk about the ghost in machine and all these kinds of things, because we've looked inside the human brain and we haven't been able to locate the person. We don't know where the person lies. It's in there somewhere, but it's not in there. It's very, very, it's a very weird place to go in terms of the investigation of these things. So now what do these things imply? And this is where then the atheist is actually, or the secular person is being very, very inconsistent. Because if all we are is material and deterministic, so we don't really have free will, we don't really have choices, then it completely throws absolutely everything out the window. Because here's the thing, right? The fact that you can ask the question in the first place, do I have free will? And a person can make a proposition for one or the other, and you can choose between the two of them. That act alone demonstrates the fact that you are not a purely deterministic thing, that you actually do have free will, and there's something about you that is transcendent. Because the fact of the matter is, when you are asking, do I have free will? And if you say yes, or if you say, let's say you say no. If you say no, what you're doing is you're making a statement of truth. Now, truth is also a transcendent thing, because physical naturalistic processes have no interest in truth. They do not generate truth. They're not designed to apprehend truth, right? The physical world, or the biological world, because we're part of the biological world, we're biological beings, and we're produced of chemistry and biology and all these kinds of things. It's not interested in truth. It's just a mechanism. It's like a machine that just chugs along. The question of truth is irrelevant. And if the world is nothing but purely physical, then there's no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as truth. And whatever you come up with, if the question that you came up with was generated by purely naturalistic chugging along processes, then your question has no meaning. It has no validity, because it's actually an illusion. So, and they're right. If we're nothing but physical, then all of this stuff is an illusion. But then the question and the affirmation that we have no choice is itself an illusory thing, and therefore irrelevant. It's actually a completely self-refuting statement. And this is what a lot of people don't realize, is that when we're dealing with these questions, these metaphysical questions, the secular person often wants to appeal to all of these physical processes, but he doesn't realize that when you're talking about things like free will and things like truth, because they're saying science establishes truth and discovers the laws in the universe, and that's the fact. Something that is a law is not a physical thing, right? Truth is not a physical thing. Choice, free will, these things are not physical things. They have an impact. They impact the physical world, right? They impact the physical world, but they themselves are not physical. And now here's the thing, right? You require, moreover, in order for you to actually have a choice, you have to live in a deterministic, law-like universe. Let me explain. Because here's one of the assertions that you hear a lot from people, especially young kids who want to do their own thing. People make the mistake that the removal of rules and regulations brings about freedom. This is actually not true. This is not true. The only reason why we can do anything is because we live in a universe where your choices have meaningful and predictable consequences, right? So it's a good thing that we live in a law-like universe where, if we know enough, we can make certain predictions, because we wouldn't be able to make a choice if we couldn't make predictions, because a choice is actually a prediction of what the outcome is going to be, right? That's what choice necessarily requires, a deterministic universe in which things are predictable, so that because if things weren't predictable, you couldn't make a choice. Because when you're saying, am I gonna go this way, or am I gonna do that way? What you're doing is you're casting your mind forward into the future to the final consequence of where these two paths are going to take you, and you're choosing one of two sets of possible futures, potentialities, right? And things can happen along the way, because, like I said, determinism doesn't imply knowability necessarily. And here's the thing, right? This is the marvel of the human being and the human mind. It's why when Christians talk about we were made in the image of God, right? There's something about us, like God stands outside of time and space and nature. Something about us actually does the same thing, in the sense where we are in the system, but we're not necessarily a part of our system. Our spirit is in the system, but not necessarily a part of it. Because here's the thing: you see something deterministic going on, like something is happening. you have a choice. You can either do nothing and allow the system to continue just on its own and result in whatever it will in a completely unmitigated way, or through the act of free will, through the act of bringing your spiritual, your mind, your free will, your intelligence to bear on the situation, you can modify the outcome of the deterministic events in order to shift it to a different conclusion, right? And some people say, well, there's certain things we can't control, therefore we don't have free will. Just because you can't control everything does not mean that you can't control some things, right? That's an all or nothing fallacy. You don't have to be able to control the entire universe in order to have free will. And so this is where it's absolutely essential. And this is where people fall flat. It's where the naturalists and the materialists fall, their theory becomes incoherent, because when they say, well, everything is deterministic, therefore we have no free will, it's like you can only have free will in a system that is deterministic, because free will relies on the fact that you can make a choice and have predictable outcomes happen, and it's those outcomes that make your choice meaningful. And that's it. And that is why in the Bible, right, we have free will, and God designs, he creates a deterministic universe governed by laws. Laws imply a lawgiver, imply a mind. There's these laws, and they're transcendent, right? They're transcendent. They have an effect on the real world. And he puts human beings made in the image of God into it, who also have a part of themselves that transcends the mere motions of atoms, so to speak, where they are in this natural world, but they are still able to influence it depending on where you go. And which is why in Christianity, even though we affirm that freedom is absolutely essential, but freedom can only be had if you have a minimum number of laws present in order to make your choices have meaningful and predictable outcomes. And this is why people want to get rid of all laws. You have two mistakes. You have two mistakes in sort of ethical, moral, legal theory. Whereas in the Bible, you find it starts out with where God has got only one rule: don't eat the tree. Just the one rule in the Garden of Eden. Right? Because they were perfect, they were living on principle, right? The laws didn't need to be made explicit. These things were self-evident, right? And they sin, and then after sin you then find that then they have 10 laws, right? And you will notice God never makes more laws than are absolutely necessary, because you need a minimum amount of necessary laws in order for the system to function. But if you have too many laws, it becomes over restrictive to the point where the system can no longer function. But if you have anything less than the absolute necessary amount of laws, namely the 10 commandments or the 10 principles, if you have anything less, then the system also begins to collapse, because then you start getting a chaos and the system falls apart. So what we happen, if you read the Bible, you always have people like the Jews, for example. The Jews ended up with too many laws. So many laws that eventually they became completely useless for all practical purposes. And Jesus fought against this kind of thing. But then in another, because like where he says you have a very fine way of setting aside the laws of God in order to observe your own traditions. So the necessary laws they didn't obey, and brought in unnecessary laws in terms of their traditions, and eventually the system collapsed and there was all kind of chaos. So the law of God represents the absolute least amount of necessary rules required for a system to function. And this is why when God says the wages of sin is death, is because anything more or less results in chaos and results in death. It results in a complete collapse of the system, which is why these laws, they're not burdensome, because they're the minimum amount required. So for example, don't drink poison, for example. That's not something that's burdensome, right? It's like if you do it, you're going to die, because there's a predictable law-like outcome to doing that thing. And so this is the balance between it. And so here's why God can then obviously he's omniscient and things like this, but this is, so people will refer to Judas. Jesus knew that Judas was going to betray him. How was he able to do that? Does that not mean that Judas, right, was predestined in some way, that he had no choice? He still had a choice. What Jesus was seeing, right? So remember earlier on I spoke about the difference between the spirit and the flesh. The flesh is your personality traits. Your flesh is very, very deterministic. So people who give up to lusts of the body and basically hedonism, they become very, very predictable. They always go after the same things, right? So people who live according to the flesh rather than according to the spirit become very, very predictable. And which is why when you look at the prophecies of God, right, in the Bible, all of the prophecies prophesy what's going to happen as the world collapses, if all the disobedience, all the things like that. So when you adhere to the way of God and adhere to the minimum amount of laws necessary in order for the system to function, right? And you live according to the spirit rather than according to the deterministic flesh, then all of a sudden your entire world of potentials opens up before you, because you're not being artificially restricted by the deterministic flesh, by the deterministic natural proclivities of the body, right? And so that's why you can tell when people give themselves up completely to what their impulses say or what their compulsions say, right? Which is why we say self-discipline is separate to that, is you control the self. So the Bible always says, gain mastery over yourself, gain control over yourself, which literally means you have the body, which is deterministic, and the executive faculties need to constantly monitor this flow in order to be like, well, this is going in the right direction, so I'll allow it, or oh no, it's going in the wrong direction. I now have to jump into the system, interpose with my intellect, with my higher faculties, into the system, or my flesh, or whatever it is that is moving things towards this undesirable end, and shift it over into the right direction. And this is what in the Bible we call repentance, right? Repent. You are on this direction, stop, change, and go into the other direction. And this is that practice of free will and things like that. And here's the thing: whether you make the choice to live according to the spirit or give up your free will and live only according to what your body tells you, so to have sex, to take drugs, whatever it might be, that self-indulgence, both of them represent a choice, represent of, I'm going to maintain my freedom of will and to always be able to exercise my will and control over my body, versus I'm going to give up my free will and let the current of the physical world and the physical body completely take me off into the distance, and I'm just going to do whatever it tells me. And this is the fallacy of the secular world that says just go and have fun and give up your thing. And that's why they're so predictable. Because, and even religious people, mind you, just because a person is religious does not mean that they're actually living according to the spirit. There's a lot of religious, because atheists would turn around and object, well, religious people are predictable. Yeah, they're very, very predictable, because not a lot of them, the vast majority of Christians, have absolutely no idea what it means to live according to the spirit rather than the flesh. Most of them are living according to the flesh, so that they give up to their own impulses. And when the Bible says, lean not on your own understanding, it's not saying shut off your brain and be an idiot. It's like, don't give yourself up to the deterministic, anti-intellectual urges of your physical self, of your physical nature, of your lower base passions. That's what it's actually talking about. That's where the fight is actually taking place in the Bible, and it's talking about the spiritual self, the self that is always in control, and because it's in control, it's in possession of free will, because when you have control, you can make choices, versus giving up your free will and just going along the current of the physical natural things. And it's a fallacy where people say that you're only truly free when you rip out all of the rules in the world. It's like, if you had no rules, for example, rip out the law of gravity, rip out the law of thermodynamics, well, then you wouldn't have anything. Nothing wouldn't exist. So you have to have a minimum amount of laws. And this is the thing, right? People that reject religion, for example, tend to love sport, tend to love games. Every single sport, every single game on the planet is governed by rules, because if you don't have the rules that specify this game, let's say football, we've just had the World Cup, football, right? You're not allowed to touch the ball with your hands, pick it up and run across the field. Why? Because if you can do that, you're no longer playing football, you're now playing rugby. You're playing something else, and it's the laws that describe what it is, the realm of what you are doing, and within that you can then have a game. It's the same thing like with chess, right? Chess, you only have this little board, right? And this is how you really need to grasp this. You have this little board with these little squares, and you have your pieces, and the rules are very, very strict, right? All these little pieces, this can only move there, that can only move there, the queen, the bishop, whatever the case might be, right? So I think there's something like 60, depending on who you ask and depending on the thing, but generally speaking, there's about 60 something to 90 odd rules that govern the game itself. I think the game itself is 60 odd rules, and then things that don't necessarily do with the game but regulate the competition, right? So the game itself is 60 something rules. But within the confines of these 60 something rules, you can play something like 1 trillion or more different varieties of the game, right? So even though you have this constraint of 60 something rules, you have more possibilities than you know what to deal with. And so if you think about the Bible, and you've got the 10 commandments, right? And the 10 commandments boil down into 2 commandments, right? Love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself, right? Some people think that that these two things are different things. It's the same thing, right? The first 4 commandments you do if you love God. The final 6, you do them if you love your neighbor. I mean, it makes sense. Hello, it's like you're not going to commit adultery if you love your neighbor. You're not going to steal if you love your neighbor. And it's the same thing, right? If you love God, you're not going to have another idol. You're not going to blaspheme his name, and so on and so forth, right? So those 10 boil down into 2, but those 10 rules, infinite possibilities within those confines, right? Because we find even today, people break these rules left, right, and the center. We've seen the dissolution of the family. We've seen the dissolution, the people wanting to rip out gender, right? They want to do away with the law of gender by saying there's 70 something different types of gender. There's a catastrophe that's going on there. Homosexuality, there's a catastrophe going on there as well, because they're violating some very, very basic rules. And just society in general is just going to pot. People running around and they're drinking and they offend each other. There's no love for your neighbor anymore. There's no love for God anymore. And it's God that underpins all of these kinds of things, because again, if there is no God and there is no transcendence, then you've only got the physical world. And therefore when atheists want to either affirm or deny that we have, whether we do or not have free will or not, they're making truth claims, and in a purely naturalistic world there's no such thing as truth. So the statement is completely irrelevant. It's self-defeating. You can't do anything. If that was actually true, you couldn't do anything, right? And they also want to make claims like religion is evil and we should do this and should do that. They try to make moral claims. They try to make truth claims. All of those things. If there is no transcendence, then those things don't actually exist. You only have the world of energy and atoms, and a world of energy and atoms will only move in one direction, and truth and stuff like that is irrelevant. Makes no sense. And the fact that we do have transcendental things that are demonstrably the case, and even moral laws, things that are universal and things of that sort, it proves that there is more. And if there is more, then we have free will, we have choice. And if there is a just God, justice and judgment is based on the fact that you can look at something and say, I had a choice, I could make X and Y and Z happen because I exercised my free will in order to go down a particular path. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope I didn't actually muddy the waters anymore for you. But do we have free will? Absolutely, man, absolutely. And a lot of the time when people arguing against things like free will. It's because, and this is when you look at this is absolutely essential. When you look at any statement out there, you always have to look, what is the worldview, what is the philosophy that is undergirding, what is the presupposition that is undergirding this particular statement. And when people are saying we have no free will, it's because what undergirds their assumptions, their presuppositions, is naturalism. And even those who presuppose naturalism but still affirm free will, they do so in direct contradiction to their worldview. Same thing with a Christian. If a Christian says yes, there is free will, they're saying that on the basis of their worldview, that there is a God, that there are transcendent things that can act freely upon the physical realm. And that is based on the fact that they believe in a God that makes laws, that provides free will, that provides a transcendent realm over and above that of the physical deterministic realm, which can then, through an exercise of will, intervene and interfere in order to bring about changes. And any Christian who says that there is no such thing as free will only does so in direct contradiction to the foundation, their presupposition, if they say that there is in fact a God, and that God not only makes judgments but makes fair and just judgments. And if we don't have free will, then that's a statement, if you're a Christian, that is directly contradicts your supposition. And it's why in the Bible it says build your house on the rock, and Jesus is the rock, Jesus is the foundation. Because if a transcendental God does not exist, if a transcendent being doesn't exist that undergirds, that provides for the transcendental nature, this metaphysical realm, and all you have is the physical, then none of these things are possible. I mean, this discussion would be completely irrelevant, because if we're just animals that are just deterministic, and everything that comes out of my mouth was determined by my biology somewhere back in the past, then everything that I'm saying to you is completely and utterly meaningless. It's just biology just doing whatever it does. And biology does not serve truth. The material physical world does not serve truth at all. So any truth statement, anyone that tries to make a truth statement whilst fundamentally believing in nothing but the physical world, it contradicts any truth. It contradicts the concept of truth entirely. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that helped you out and doesn't muddy the waters and clarifies a few things. It's really, really quite essential that we grab onto these things and so we don't get confused, and always test whenever someone says something, try reduce it to its first principles, and that's usually then how you'll be able to figure out whether they're being consistent or not. So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, that is it. Thank you very much for watching this. Please share this to other people. These concepts that I'm talking about are not my own. This is stuff that I learned from other people. I'm just sharing. I'm just passing on the knowledge. As like a duty of people that learn stuff. You got to share it. He who shares and teaches learns twice. So go ahead, do me that favor. Help my channel out too. Help maybe some other people out that have these questions. And yeah, thank you very much. I'm done. I'm going to leave it there. Goodbye, thank you, and God bless. Exercise your free will. Don't let anything take away your free will. Exercise it, own it, and own your responsibility. You're responsible for your free will. Don't forget it. Goodbye. God bless. Cheerio.